Welcome, everyone. Delighted to have you here. I hope some of you were here yesterday when we had another interesting talk. Just some housekeeping things to start with. There are 2 fire exits, one on either side. Should there be a problem, there are sprinklers here. There is an alarm. Please do not use the lift if there is a fire. We have wide staircases on either side. You'll be fine. Please turn off or make silent your mobile phones. It's very rude to have your mobile phone ringing while the program's going on. Thank you all for coming. I'd like to begin with thanking Dr. Sanjana Hattotuwa for being here. He's an old friend, not so old, but an old friend, who we've known for a very long time for all sorts of reasons. But in my own case, he played a very important role when I was a state guest, and did some very, very interesting analysis behind the scenes. So my colleagues have been bugging me for a long time to get him across. So I'm very happy that we have been able to do that. He's going to talk about storytelling, but resistance through storytelling, and he will do that. We were yesterday going on the car, and one of the things I remembered, because we were talking about how history is made and how narratives are changed, one of the things I came across was a statement which I liked very much, which says, God can't change the past, but historians can. And I found that quite interesting. But I would like to extend that, because I think while historians can change the past, there's another group of people who can, and that is storytellers. And storytellers can go beyond that. They can change the past, they can change the present, and they can influence the future. So that makes them very, very powerful. And to be able to control the narrative gives you a strength that should not be underestimated. So Sanjana will talk about resistance as a narrative, but he will also talk about issues that relate to truth and trust. And will take us through a 70-year-old journey, which goes back to the tobacco industry and things like that, and how they've used campaigns for getting their messages across. When we take this cool drag and when we think we are being very hip and very modern, very independent, we often forget that we have been shaped over a very long period of time by someone else who's been influencing our mindsets. And that is an important thing to recognize, that our minds are not always free and are influenced by many things. But the second last slide, or a slide towards the end, I enjoyed very much, where he has a lovely, fun, poetic take on democracy, which includes some of the things that happened yesterday as we were walking down. But of course, part of what we're talking about will relate to disinformation. And for us, it's particularly significant because when the government itself becomes the biggest source of disinformation, and they have the resources at their hands which none of us can compete with, it becomes something that we need to seriously think about. But as Sanjana himself showed, and many of my colleagues and many of you showed during the Free Shahidul campaign, one of the things he was able to do was to monitor how social media was being influenced and what the trolling agents were trying to do. And one of the things that came through his work, and perhaps through that of others, is the power that we have. And I hope through this work we will begin to recognize the strength that we do have. And one of the things I would like us to go away with is to remember that we should never underestimate ourselves. We have a strength we don't always sufficiently value. And I think we have that strength in resistance. So I'm not going to talk any more about that. Sanjana, over to you. I don't know whether you want to speak here or go to the podium. It's all yours. Can we have a hand?
Assalamu alaikum, namaskar, Bhobon, and good evening. Thank you for that wonderful introduction, Shahidul. I am here in Dhaka for the first time after 2003, which is a very long time away. I wanted to come back sooner, but for the past 6 or 7 years, I've been very, very far away. I've been in New Zealand. I only recently returned to Sri Lanka, and the geographical proximity made it easier, I suppose, to hop across 3.5 hours on a 3.5 hour flight and come speak with you today. The reason I wanted to come much earlier is because of the gentleman who introduced me and who's put this 9-story miracle of sorts together. The brick and mortar here is an oasis, not, I think, just for Dhaka, but for South Asia. It's an extraordinary place. I have been blown away by every floor and every story. And I mean that in the English sense of both the narrative story, but also in terms of the architecture. Every floor of this building is a miracle. It's an extraordinary gift to this country, as he and his partner and Drik, and I feel so privileged to be here in his company, as his guest, and in this country. If there is any one example of what the exemplar, I think, of a country and its people and its community and the best it can be it is here. And I wanted to thank you, Shahidul, very much for this very kind introduction. I want to spend a bit of time talking about what is up there on the screen. My instruction has been to leave you with some thoughts around how even under very austere circumstances, such as that we have in Bangladesh and in Sri Lanka and in many other parts of South Asia, the power of the story. I assume that there are journalists amongst us here. I assume that there are people who are not card-carrying journalists, but write their stories as well on social media. How these stories matter, even though you might not think that they do, particularly, as Shahidul said, when we are dealing with a state infrastructure that is extremely powerful and today globally, but also domestically very good at corrupting the mind of the body politic and public in ways that we can't match. So what do you do? And I understand the frustration and I understand the resignation, but I wanted to leave some thoughts about the power of stories, and particularly in today's world, the power of storytelling using technology and the media that we all now have literally in the palms of our hands. That, for those who read and may be familiar with Ben Rhodes' book on the Obama years, his first book, is where I want to start. It's a great book, better than the second one, actually. Ben Rhodes was a very close associate of President Obama, and basically talks about how the Obama administration, well, at least Ben Rhodes, dealt with the world as it was presented. By the way, for those who are taking photos, I'm perfectly happy to leave this PowerPoint behind with Drik and distribute it as you see fit. So it's fine taking photos, but if you want the presentation, it'll be available as well. And I think that's what we can do. I think in Sri Lanka, at least, and in India, you have this concept of horoscopes as a world that one is born into, dependent on time and date, that is preordained. And there's very little, in a sense, that you can do, because even the person you're going to marry is preordained. And the compatibility also is checked with astrological charts before that marriage can take place. And I think for journalists and storytellers and civil society activists and human rights activists in particular, this is the world we have to deal with. And we strive and struggle to change it, but there is a power in recognizing that there is a deck of cards that has been dealt. Life has dealt us these cards. And I think that what motivates many of us in this room, certainly while you come braving the traffic outside to listen to this, is that because you're not happy with it. you're not satisfied with it. You feel that there is something wrong. You feel that things need to change. Nobody who is happy with the state of the world is here. You wouldn't be here. You simply wouldn't. And so all of us have this je ne sais quoi, as they would say in French, something that, there are less polite words in my language back home that speak to an itch in one's posterior that compels us to change the world into something better, to mold it into something that is more equitable. The problem is, and this is where my subject domain experience comes into play, what I study every day, and what I have studied even before my PhD, was the manner in which those with power, and very often those in power, use and manipulate and abuse and misuse the tools that they have to retain that power or to remain in power. Now, the disinformation is actually a word that may be reported on quite a bit today, but when you look at it, when you look at its roots, almost exactly 70 years ago in December, a group of companies met at the Plaza Hotel in New York, knowing full well, even 70 years ago, that there was a direct connection between smoking and cancer. But what they wanted to do was to deny that connection. And the contemporaneous story, I suppose, in this regard is climate change and what oil companies are doing today, which is the same playbook as that which was laid out and over decades constructed, perfected, rolled out globally, that began with the tobacco industry. And, I'm a student of literature, which is why I like alliteration, but this is exactly what they did. They sought to deny the effects or the deleterious effects of smoking. They wanted to distract public attention from it. They wanted to bombard the public with so much of information that they didn't know what was true and not. And they wanted to basically lie and say that there was no connection. These are the four, if any one of you likes to dance, if any one of you is a weekend DJ, or even a full-time DJ, you'll understand that depending on how you switch the tempo of the music, depending on how you transition from one song to the other, depending on the volume, depending on the pace, depending on the mood, depending on what people are responding to based on what you're playing back, you can control that audience. The DJ is the master of that space. And disinformation in the hands of those in and with power are the masters of society. Because as Shahidul said, they literally can change the way we think. And this is a particularly problematic thing in our context because we tend to conflate those we trust as being the persons who also say the truth. It's a cultural thing, right? I mean, the more gray hair you have, the less you're willing to question, particularly if you're a young person. At least in Sri Lanka, it's absolutely horrendous. We don't question our teachers. They get away talking all sorts of bullshit. But because you have that hierarchy, you just don't question it. And then, of course, that applies to society as well. And so the problem is that people we, at least in a societal level, consider to be trustworthy, we also automatically assume have a handle on what's true. And that can lead us into all sorts of problems. In families, but also in terms of larger communities as well. And when you talk about, the work that I do, the subject that I study is very complex. I don't think that comes across in media reporting. Disinformation is this term that is loosely used, and it's actually quite tough, yeah? It's not easy. To simplify it without too much of violence to that complexity, it's generally what you see up there. If I were to distill all of what I do on a daily basis, it is to unpack what you see up there. It is the shaping of minds at a societal scale. It is to capture your attention. It's like a drug, really, at the end of the day. It is to capture our attention and to retain it. And by retaining it, corrupt your perception of the world. And it is to what we call, academics call, emotional valence. Emotional valence speaks to that which is up there on the slides. It's a constant feeling of sadness, anger, anxiety, and fear. These are things that don't make you happy. There are 4 distinct things. And if you take a look at, for example, parenthetically, the way Facebook hooks us to the news feed, all of what Facebook has done since the inception of the company, algorithmically, is based on that last point. It is to hook us. And in the old journalism world, we called it what bleeds leads. And this is today's algorithmic world. You combine this with the unlimited resources of state apparatus, or high net worth individuals, or transnational corporations, and pardon the language, but you've got a complete shit show. And the problem is, you don't know how pervasive and persuasive it is. Because the invisibility of how it grapples and corrupts our mind is its power. You see this with COVID-19, and particularly in the United States. I can't speak with authority on Bangladesh, but certainly in Sri Lanka as well. There's a political scientist called Lee McIntyre who called today's world the political subordination of reality. It's a strange thing. In the United States, depending on whether you're partial to Trump or not, there was an incredible, strong correlation around whether you took the vaccine or not. And in the United States, that meant, depending on your perception of Trump, you lived or died during COVID-19. Because if you didn't take the vaccination, you probably would have died of COVID-19. And so the research suggests that today, what you believe, the stories that you hold to be dear and true, shape your reality to a degree that is actually an existential crisis. It determines quite literally whether you live or die. It's extraordinary. And now, after COVID-19, you have the problem of measles, and all these other things coming back up again. I know we have at least one Sri Lankan in this audience, and I've been very disturbed to hear that Sri Lanka, a country which eradicated measles, is now having to deal with the prospect of it coming back again. And that is because and a consequence of what happened during the pandemic. Let's now talk about that itch in our posterior, in why we all are here. What is the world as it should be? Why do we go to sleep at night and wake up the next day in a country like Bangladesh or Sri Lanka or India or Pakistan without just switching bloody careers and turning on the television and giving up? What compels us to do what we do? And what examples can we find from this region that can help us keep doing that? And that is why I want to talk a bit about the stories of dissent. And again, to talk about how in those 4 words, I believe that activism and journalism and storytelling and a resistance to power can be constructed by rendering the invisible, by reclaiming our stories as our stories, not allowing anybody else to say it, not allowing the state to say who we are, not allowing an algorithm to say who we are, not allowing Facebook to present who we are, but telling our story ourselves, our voice. And by recentering the story on where it matters, because if you take a look at it, disinformation, always remember what the tobacco companies did, or still do actually, and big oil does. They try to say, no, that's not important, let's talk about something else. And I think that the stories of dissent refocus, recenter the frame, if you want to talk about it through a photography vocabulary, on what is important or what should be important. And I want to talk about, at the risk of embarrassing the person up here on stage with me, what the Free Shahidul movement did and achieved. And I want to very clearly stress, though it was very kindly noted that this was something to do with me, it wasn't really anything to do with me. I was bearing witness to and maybe amplifying and curating and presenting what this good man and what happened to him resulted in on a global stage. And that hashtag was present on both Twitter and Facebook at the time. And what I did was to respond to the news. Shahidul, was it 5th August, right? When it hit all of us that this had occurred, I, for 15 years, ran Sri Lanka's first civic media platform called Ground Views. I've since, moved on, but the platform is still there. And it was the only and first platform that completely rebranded all our social media properties with a campaign linked to the campaign on social media to free Shahidul from prison. And so that was immediate. And it was very useful that we had these iconic now photos, because I don't know how much he's talked about this with you, but in the stories that he's told me, it was fundamentally important that those photos were taken and that he made a bit of a fuss, because it gave us the visual material globally to create a fuss. It may be Shahidul's innate DNA gene that we don't have, that's missing from the rest of us, that sees himself in the third eye and understands the power of the visual image to communicate a very powerful story. But whatever be the case, that photo became our brand. It basically took over our social media in Sri Lanka. And using Ground Views as the kind of base or platform or node or network, however you want to see it, I then started to study a global movement on Twitter and Facebook alone, but also partly on YouTube, though I didn't focus on it too much, on how the world responded to what was going on. And in just 72 hours, I put up this image. I do what's called network science, which is actually a science, part of which includes data visualization. This is actually a very simple graph. I do data visualizations around millions of data points. What can be quite aesthetically pleasing to the eye in terms of some of these renders can actually be a very violent story, which is one of the ironies of what I do. But I presented the visual as what you call a network graph, and even if you didn't understand a thing about how this was rendered, it visually presented 72 hours after he was taken in that there was a global community pissed off and wanted him released. He wasn't alone. That was the message. And if you continue to incarcerate him, you are going to piss everybody off more and more and more and more, which is what's called the Streisand effect. The Streisand effect is connected to Barbra Streisand, who was a famous Hollywood actress and linked to a house of hers that she didn't want, I think, known to be a house of hers, but because she didn't want it to be known, everybody knew it was the house of hers. And so it's connected to this thing where the more you try to hide something, the more it becomes better known. And so I connected it to the Streisand effect, where they wanted to do it under the literal shadow of darkness, but it completely boomeranged in their face. And so that was the network graph. And I also wanted to make it very, very clear that I wasn't cooking up these figures. These were independently verifiable figures around an engagement that just 3 days after Shahidul's arbitrary detention had generated significant engagement and significant commentary. So this was just on Twitter, and the aim was to present that. That was the story, that was the narrative, that was the framing. But as I said, please bear in mind that these names and these accounts that you find up there were all tweeting as well. So, what they were saying was also important, yeah? But this was a rendition or a render of what the collective looked like, if you will, a family behind Shahidul. And as I said, the more you try to hide it, the more you try to shove it under the blanket, as it were, the more you try to say, this is not a story, that Shahidul is not important, really. We do this all the time. There are others in prison as well. The more it became a story. And that's a problem, because you don't want it to become a story. The more it becomes a story, the more there is a political cost of having Shahidul in prison. And the thing about this is that the government knows. My government knows, your government knows, the American government knows, everybody knows. I'm not unique in what I do. I do it very well, but I'm not unique in it. And the power to do network science, sadly, in our countries resides with those in and with power, and very often a militarized or securitized state. And you saw that when a couple of days later, they tried to do what's called hashtag hijacking. I had studied this a couple of years ago in the Maldives, when the Maldives was going through a democratic crisis. And they basically, this is the first attempt, they basically tried to take over the Free Shahidul Alam hashtag by putting all sorts of other stuff, pro-government stuff. So when you subscribe to that hashtag, as those of you who use Twitter may understand hashtags to work, you got all of this other stuff, not related to Shahidul, or praising the government of the day and even today. So I found that very interesting. It was a very rudimentary, basic attempt, but it showed that they knew that this was a problem. It showed that they knew on social media that this good man was creating a shitstorm around the world, and they didn't know what to do with it. Then in September, we had another hashtag hijacking, and this was more sophisticated, because by that time, they knew that this was a global movement. It had evolved into something quite serious. Statements had been made. People were talking about it globally, internationally, and domestically as well. And then they started a fairly serious hashtag attempt with greater volume, greater intent, and greater sophistication. Now, 6 or 7 years ago, when you compare it to what is happening today, it's still rudimentary. But remember, 6 or 7 years ago, this was really quite sophisticated. And when it's not here, my account is now private, but the tweets are all there. When I did a forensic analysis, when I dug into what's called the pathologies of it, who is doing this, you found a network of accounts that were connected to the government. This is really interesting, both in terms of what I understand to be individuals and unnamed entities that, apart from what they were doing with this hashtag, all of the other content was pro-government. And that was really interesting, because by that time in September, they had realized that they needed to up their game as well. And then, of course, things happened. And in November, late November, thankfully, this good man was released from prison. And by that time, only through Twitter, I had connected with 3 members of his family who to date I've never met. And they were amplifying what I was doing. Of course, with much more love. And they had a a greater stake than I ever could in that process. And that is why they were doing it. I know one of them was in England at the time. I don't know where the other two were. But they latched on to what I was doing and amplified it. And that was really interesting for what I'll talk about on the next slide. But by the time that Shahidul was released, I mean, I'm not going to repeat those figures. It was a global phenomenon. It was significant. These are not insignificant figures. For a single case, I mean, globally, you have to keep in mind that, there are things happening. Shahidul wasn't the only one in prison. There were things political that were happening around the world. But that's a fairly large, significant engagement on both Facebook and Twitter. I was able to look at what accounts were behind it, what they were saying, visualize it, analyze it, what it resulted in, how the message was spread. If it started from London, it spread to Dhaka. If it started from Dhaka, it spread to New York. And I was able to kind of present that as the story behind this man's story, as a global story. And what was really interesting is that, as I said earlier, those three family members and what they did on Twitter was central to, quite literally central to, what the Free Shahidul campaign on Twitter looked like. And you can see that in the concentration of those three, what we call nodes, it's an academic term, those three individuals on Twitter, you could see the concentration of it and the irradiation, the kind of hub and spoke effect. What they did was central to the conversation on Twitter under the hashtag to create the global movement that ultimately led to that photo. And I quoted Maya Angelou, and then I stopped. I was very happy to stop my data collection. And, I thought I had given all the data to Shahidul back in the day, but, 2 days ago, I handed all of that stuff to him. There are tens of thousands of tweets, tens of thousands of comments that reflect solidarity that traversed time, that traversed language, that traversed boundaries. And I did this high-resolution render. This is a very, 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 very high-resolution render in its original format, obviously not here. This spaghetti, or this constellation, is a render of all of the accounts from August to November that were part of the Free Shahidul movement. Every single dot there is a person, an account. And the connections are between what those people said. And for reasons of privacy, but at the time also safety, I took away all the names, so all the labels that I could see I took away. But it's such a powerful visual narrative of a global conversation of agitation, anger, anxiety, but at the end of the day, relief that this good man was released from prison. This is the shit show that overcame the government's ability to subsume it. It's a hell of a story. And so that is the power of narratives, really, at the end of the day. And I use the plural because it is the plural. It's not one story. It was the multiplicity of it, collectively, that made a difference. And I really believe that if you want to get the world to listen to you, tell your bloody story. Go out there and say it. I know that we have the editor of a platform that I'll talk about a bit later called Global Voices that do it very well. But if you think you are not going to make an impact, then you've lost. If you think that you're not going to make a dent or a difference, then you're already giving the authority and the victory to those in power who want to silence you. So what really are you doing? So make the world witness what you want them to be a witness to. And I always say, and I know that some of you may have come here thinking that I'll talk about social media and, the latest, greatest generative AI apps. And I actually did a presentation to Pathshala on generative media, but I don't talk about technology. I know technology, a lot of it. I know it because that's what Groundviews did in South Asia. We created the first iOS app for civic media. We created the first iPad app. We created the first Facebook account, the first Twitter account, the first responsive website. We created the first websites in the country that used Unicode. We created the first 360-degree videos that were interactive. We created the first soundscapes. We created the first mobile-first journalism, i.e. the kind of content that you could read on your mobile phone. We have innovated tech more than mainstream media in the region. So I know tech. We have broken boundaries with what we've done. But it is not the tech that is important. It is the story. The tech is ancillary. It supports what you want to do. If the tech becomes the story, then I feel you've lost your way. You need to figure out what you want to say and then use tech to support it. This is what, I don't even know whether some of you remember what Facebook looked like before the like button was invented. This was in December 2007. As I said, it's the first ever civic media site for South Asia. And the reason I created it is because they couldn't kill it. They couldn't burn it down. The Sri Lankan government has an amazing proclivity to believe that they can kill and burn down things or kill individuals and life's going to be okay. And they've been very good at doing it, actually. But the reason why Groundview started a Facebook page back in the day, and Facebook was a very different platform, was because it was irrepressible. You couldn't shut it down. You couldn't shut down Groundviews. You had to shut down the whole platform, and even then it was a problem if you did that. The video playing is a video from 16 years ago that shows on an edge network, on a Nokia 3110, my Nokia, the first ever Sinhala website on a phone, on a mobile phone. And the reason again is not the tech, but I wanted to ensure that in not just in English, but in the two other languages that are spoken far more broadly in the country, critical content and critical stories and critical dissent and the stories that wouldn't be up on mainstream media had a way of directly going to the palms of people's hands. So the rendering there, the rendering tech wasn't really the important point. The point I wanted to experiment with 16 years ago was getting people the story directly to the people. And that's why we did what we did. And as I said, that's an edge network on a 3310. It looks so silly now. So the other way of looking at it, and I know that the journalists here would be really, wedded to a column or investigative journalism or what they write. You might be a visual storyteller, you might be a visual journalist, and that's good, that's great, that's fine. But a story can also be presented in different ways. And we experimented with that in Sri Lanka. I mean, remember, Sri Lanka's gone through hell and back, yeah? And so this wasn't an easy country to work in. And what we tried to do, which may be resonant here too now, is we used the arts. We used culture, we used theater, we used literature, and all forms of it to tell the stories that wouldn't be told otherwise and to share the inconvenient truths. And this follows a very long tradition, by the way, in Sri Lanka of theater bearing witness to violence, including in the horrific late 1980s, which I grew up in, where extrajudicial killings were a daily occurrence, and also throughout the entirety of the 30-year-old war. So there are different ways of telling stories that I think many of us are completely blind to. And ironically and counterintuitively, the better you are in one form of storytelling, be it journalism or documentary making, the more blind you are to other forms of storytelling that can embellish what you do. And all of this, by the way, what we did was digitally packaged and then spread out. So it didn't remain in the physical domain. It was based on whatever platform that we used. It was, if it was on Twitter, it was photos. If it was on Facebook, it was videos, so on and so forth. And it became a way to communicate stories over social media. And here's a slide that I thought would kind of like really pique your curiosity. This is the number 10, this is the cat in Downing Street, Larry. Larry actually is a real cat, yeah? Obviously, it's not the cat tweeting. But Larry survived, given the shambolic state of the United Kingdom at the moment and its politics. Larry survived several prime ministers. And Larry's account on Twitter is an incredibly interesting and incisive political critique of the United Kingdom today, through a cat. And if you look at Rishi Sunak's Twitter account, the Prime Minister of UK, and you look at Larry the cat gets by order of magnitude more engagement. Consistently. It's a cat. But why is this cat so engaging? So it's told from the perspective of a cat. Most of it is cat photos. But it's, particularly even during the consequential elections that were just held in the United Kingdom, there's political commentary that folks are really interested in. So what would it be to tell the story of Dhaka or Bangladesh through the perspective of a street dog or a raven or a pigeon or a cat? Just think about the storytelling potential in just that. All of us, Shahidul in particular through photography, to which Drik is a testimony to, but all of us, I think if you're storytellers, want to make somehow that which is not there present, that which cannot be there, those who cannot be spoken of, like Voldemort from Harry Potter. That's what we try to do. We try to render the invisible. And again, what we tried to do in Sri Lanka was to create that presence of what was absence. And what was absent was very violently removed. Right? These are hard, traumatic, bloody stories. And not just of one, or not just of 100, and not just of a few thousand, of tens of thousands. And one of the things that we wanted to do was that if there was silence, we said that there was silence. So we got people asking, why is there silence? Why don't I see something? Because sometimes it doesn't click, because we never, in our school books, we're not taught that. So we don't even know what questions to ask. It's only when you tell somebody that this entire period, this entire community, this entire person, this entire process, this entire development, this entire perspective, this entire gender, this entire institution is not there, that they say, oh, what? We didn't know that. And then you ask the most powerful question of all that makes autocrats lose their sleep. You ask why. And we got people to ask why. This is a recent story from a colleague of mine who runs the Tamil equivalent called Matram of Ground Views. And this is about disappearances. For those of you who don't know, Sri Lanka has the second highest disappearances in the world. Right? These are extrajudicial killings, abductions, torture, horrific stuff over decades, mass graves. You name it, we have it. And the endeavor was, how do you render that? It's a hard, bloody story here. And how do you render it in a way that's sensitive to the victims, of the survivors? And so he went to these families and he asked them, show me what you have that reminds you of the person who is not with you. And it's, some of us just broke down in tears when we saw this. It's just simple stuff. People think of memorialization as statues and processions and protest marches. It's a mobile phone, it's a horoscope, it's a wooden tray, it's a shirt. Sometimes it's nothing, it's just feet. Those feet are the feet of walking hundreds of kilometers barefoot just in search of answers. So here's a way, again, of very powerful storytelling. The story matters, the artifacts matter, the tech is ancillary and secondary, but it's compelling. And this is a story, I think, that is familiar to you too, and that some of Shahidul's books and Drik's books have also dealt with in terms of extrajudicial killings and disappearances. But we're not the only one. If you want inspiration from the global south or the global majority, there's a platform called Rest of the World, Rest of World. Fantastic stories on the invisible and rendering the invisible and telling our stories by ourselves, which is very important as well, as Shahidul always preaches and teaches. And this is, of course, something that I grew up with. I don't even know whether some of you, given the age in the audience, know what a cyber cafe was. But this is something that I grew up with, and as a student in Delhi University, I both frequented and also studied. And they're not there now. And so, it's kind of talking about not just, the whole story here is not about the tech or the web or the cyber cafe, but how these places were community-oriented. And you don't have that, and you have nothing like it anymore, because now we are atomized in our consumption of media through the palms of our hands. This is a cultural and communal life across our part of the world, but also in Africa, never going to come back again. So, it was so important to record it, and Rest of World does stories like that. We have in the midst of our audience the editor from Bangladesh, who is responsible for the content that goes up on a platform called Global Voices. Fabulous platform. A platform that you would go to read stuff that you simply won't see anywhere else, quite literally, and for years and years and years. High-grade journalism. Right? If you go to the New York Times or Wall Street Journal and you think that Pulitzer Prize-winning journalists are the bee's knees, go to Global Voices, because there's some really good stuff here. And they're written not by some parachuting journalist from the global north who comes in when there's blood on the street, but they're written by you. They're written by people who live and negotiate that reality every day, which is why Global Voices is so unique. And the final point that I would encourage you to think about is, if you are tired, and I understand that, if you feel that you need a break, which is very important, if you feel that you can't do everything that you want to do, there's a lot that you can do to record things. Even if you don't create something immediately, record it. Recording is power. Recording is subordinating. Recording something is bearing witness. At a very fundamental level, it says that in the future, if you want to say it didn't happen, I have evidence that it did. It's a phenomenally powerful thing to do. And all of us now can do it in ways that you couldn't do it previously, because we have a camera wherever we go, and sometimes by our bedside as well. And so bearing witness at an individual level, at a communal level, at an institutional level, but also creating solidarities. One of the wonderful things about this brick and mortar building we are in is that it's also an idea. It's a wonderful, unique idea, because we have shared stories. Your story is my country's story. My country's story is India's story. We don't have to go to any other part of the world to learn and to share solidarities. And that's so important, and bearing witness helps with that. My country went through this. It's not the only one. We seem to be able to go through several versions of the same exercise in futility, as it were, every couple of years. This was called the Lessons Learned and Reconciliation Commission after the end of the war, a massive nationwide effort to, understand why the war happened, put simply. And so there were thousands of people who gave testimony. It's a serious thing, right? You could have been skeptical about it, but there were people who gave testimony, cried, and wanted their story to be recorded. there is not a single record of it officially anymore. Not one. A national effort after the end of the war. Tens of millions spent. Nothing. The only records you can find are in places, I don't take pride in this, it's profoundly sad, but the only places that you can find those records are, because I knew this would be the eventuality, is on ground views. Not at the National Archives, not anywhere else. And so ground views is now a custodian of our country's narrative history as well, including through processes that the government itself embarked upon but never recorded. I have had this nag with me since 2002. I am a hoarder. I love methodically arranging what I have, but I find it really hard to give up what I have. That's not a material thing. So I hear my late father's voice in my head, who ingrained in me this Buddhist teaching of not, hoarding stuff. And so it's not in that sense that I say it. You see, when I started to use computers, the damn things crashed all the time, right? And so you always had multiple backups. And because of the context that I grew up in, and it was so unstable and society was so volatile, you always stored things. Your family photos, nothing, just your family albums, you stored them in places where thieves couldn't get it or the fire wouldn't upset it. So I've always had, before in my adult life, I understood it to be a more disciplined approach, this urge to safeguard things, to store things. What you find there is something that I've done since 2002. So it's now, over 2 decades old. It's a repository of content from 2002 onwards that doesn't exist anywhere else in Sri Lanka. At all. Anywhere else, including at the National Archives or private archives. And so it's the only repository of some fundamentally important historical moments and movements and processes and developments and things and collections that is now, quite frankly, the only place that researchers and students and historians and scholars can go to. And that is also power, because the politician of tomorrow can't come and say that something wasn't said, or something wasn't done, or something was done, because you can always go and check. And without this, there was no other place you could. I want to end by talking about the story of democracy, but stories maybe for democracy and stories from democracy. Shahidul, I think, reminds us, or certainly reminds his partner more than us, as she's written in her foreword of an incredible book, that academics are really bad at communicating. And that whenever we, for example, political scientists talk of democracy, it's some jargon that you don't understand what the bloody hell is about, right? It has liberal, Marxist, constructivist, democratic, goes to the Greeks, it, goes to the Renaissance, so it just kind of goes over your head. That's a problem for us. Why? I think many of us in this room weren't born into democracy. It is a romance that we have of something that we want to see and bring about, if not for us, then for our children. So it's this enduring love affair with something that we want to see realized. And fundamentally, as journalists or as storytellers, I think one of the real challenges that face us in countries where there is a significant democratic deficit is to render to your heart, not necessarily to your mind, what democracy is. It needs to go to the heart, because intellectually, the mind is already corrupted. But if you can speak to the heart, I think there's some hope for our countries and societies around finding what that means. And I take great inspiration from, it's freely available online. I encourage you to go and read it. E.B. White wrote this wonderful letter to the New Yorker in 1943 on the meaning of democracy. It's just lovely. It's beautiful. And apparently F.D. Roosevelt loved it and couldn't get enough of it. And I used that to reflect on after I had met Shahidul yesterday, to write to you maybe a love letter from Sri Lanka that collectively refers and recalls and frames what democracy should be from a non-political scientist perspective. And I want to actually read this out to you because I think there's power in reading it out as opposed to just seeing it on the screen, though I know everybody's taking a photo of it. Democracy is the cricket score. It's to fight over the best rasgulla in town and to share a hot shingara. It is the photographer, publisher, and poet free to frame, question, and critique. It is an ordinary conversation in a lift about torture and promising to continue doing what invited it. It is to find the best doctor in a public hospital and a policeman who arrests the person he voted for. And I wrote this sentence after last night's rain. It is rain that doesn't end in flooding. It is an embrace by a stranger who saw you speak once and saw themselves. It is random acts of kindness in prison and those in it who defy being defined by a carceral state. Democracy is the education recognized more than a surname, the dignity of a teacher, the chalk crusted under fingernails. It is a sari next to hijab. It resides in quietness, the missing sirens, the horns never used. Democracy is the editor-feted, the inspired young journalist, the activists as role models, and a Drik that isn't extraordinary. It is the Dalit's dream realized, mangroves thriving, and the midday birdsong. It is to sit under a tree and hear only a hushed rustle. Democracy is a short queue, politeness, and getting anywhere without a car. It is a ticket. It is clean air everywhere. It is to meet the politician you never once voted for, shopping alone, and argue vehemently about the best halim in town. It is to laugh openly at the Prime Minister in public. It is a Prime Minister who laughs with you as loudly. It is the cartoonist who only fears that his ink will run out. It is the Dhonnobad said to the rickshawala, seeing him as a person. Democracy is pavements, votes counted and votes that count. It's in drains, clean water, the train that's on time, and reflected in children playing on the lawns of Jatiya Sangsad, open again to the public. Democracy is a person with everything to lose, continuing to question power because it matters to those who go silent or are killed, their families, their friends, and this country. It is the idea of an ideal and its more perfect realization every day. It is hope. And I want to end there by thanking once again all of you for coming, and Shahidul for this warm invitation to share some thoughts which I hope have been useful. As I was figuring out the last slide, I came across this wonderful poem by Nazneen, who's an academic in the United Kingdom, and has an interpretation of Dhonnobad, which, as I said, I'm a student of English literature. I love it. I just fell in love with that. How wonderful it is. In New Zealand, you say, "Good day, mate. How's it going?" And that's how you, greet each other. You say, "Yana," and you say, "Thanks, mate." But in our cultures, Ayubowan, Dhonnobad, the greetings in the language of the roots of Sanskrit, these mean something. These are the stories of our countries. These are your stories. Reclaim that story. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, after that, you have a tough act to follow. I'd just like to tell you a little bit about Dhonnobad as it's used here. There's a wonderful Bangla expression that says, "Ami apnake dhonnobad diye lojja debo na." I will not embarrass you by thanking you. So on that note, I'd like to open it up to questions from the floor, please. Let's keep the questions short because we'd like to have as many people participating as possible. And of course, there's no limits. Whatever you think is worth asking is something you can ask. Yes, please. If you could introduce yourself as well.
Hello, everyone. My name is Monis. I am a student here at Pathshala, and I've worked as a journalist for 3 years. I have a question for you, Doctor, that it's one of your slides said that silence is story. From your experience, from your collective works and over the years that you have spent doing this work, I would like to ask you how, as a person, as a journalist, I can document or write about silence.
Yeah, it's about first acknowledging that there is a silence. As I said, or I tried to communicate, a lot of people don't understand silence. You see, as many of us would have understood for the first time, I think, in our lives, when COVID-19 hit and the streets went empty and they were taken over by nature, globally, we didn't hear anything. And it is only then that we comprehended in our urban or village lives, particularly urban lives, what a lot of noise pollution there is. Yeah? In the morning today, I recorded what the sound was outside my hotel, and I can say it's a soundscape that I've never experienced before. It's horns all the time, and it's amazing, really, at least for this visitor. I don't know what it is like to live in this country, particularly if you're adjacent to a main road. But if you have grown up with it, as, for example, people growing up next to a railway track, that's what you know, right? So my point is that unless you frame the silence, which sounds counterintuitive, but say that there is a gap here, that say there is something missing, that say that there isn't something framed, that say is something that history and historical accounts and official accounts and mainstream media isn't telling you, then sometimes lots of people don't know that. And so you're angry at the wrong reason. Because you know that. You hold it in yourself, you're negotiating it, your loss, it's in your heart, but others don't know that. And sometimes I found that if it's not entirely possible to do anything more or other than just saying that there is a silence, that in and of itself is powerful. Because again, what I tried to communicate is that that question why is a really powerful one. Parents funk it. Because when we want to tell our child not to eat too much of chocolate and they ask why, and if you don't know, at a certain age it just gets too tedious, and then you say, particularly South Asian parents, you will do as I say, right? Because you can't be bothered arguing. But in our adult lives, that is the unraveling of power, that is the unraveling of hagiography, that is the unraveling of history, that is the unraveling of gendered, misogynistic, parochial, patriarchal, political architectures. That simple question of asking why, if you can render the silence and just get people to ask why, that in and of itself can be quite powerful. Just recording the silences. And then, as you find your courage, or if you find the opportune moments and maybe a better context, then you can explore yourself, right? You can put in yourself, what wasn't recorded, what those silences constituted. But I think it's really important and fundamentally important to record the silences as a first step, if you will. What we are not taught, what we are unable to ask, what is not in our peripheral or our primary vision at a national level, but also at a personal level. And I'll end by saying that, you see, a lot of these things, you tend to think of these as grand projects of a 9-story Drik, of a Shahidul Alam. At the end of the day, and more fundamentally and much more usefully sometimes, it's just the dinner time conversation with our grandmother or our friend. Or our extended family or our relative. All of the racism is there in family gatherings. And you start there. And find the courage to say, actually, there's a lot that you're not talking about. Actually, there are stories that you don't know, which is why you have this opinion. Start there. And then I think if you all individually did that, the silences will become deafening.
I'd like to just add to that in the sense that silence, I think, is not the same for everyone. Different people will read that silence in different ways. And I can tell from personal experience, when I first arrived in Britain in 1972, and one of the things that struck me most, there were many things which I was not familiar with, it was all new. But what struck me the most was that at night, I didn't hear the sound of gunfire. I'd gotten so used to the rat-a-tat-tat every night, every day, all the time, that suddenly there was no machine gun fire. It was very, very strange. It took me a while to get used to. I'm sure that silence would have meant different things to different people. There's a question at the back.
Thank you so much for the wonderful, enlightening presentation. I am Saimum. I teach law at Brack University. So my question is regarding, in the name of so-called community standard or national or governmental policies, the tech platforms are doing shadow banning. For those who don't know what is shadow banning, like you wrote a very critical post on politics, culture, etc., your posts don't get that much reach. It is not restricted, invisible, but it don't interact with that much people. My question is that the tech platforms these days, they say that this is because of the fault of our algorithms, but for us, it is the question of democracy. It is the question of survival. It is the question of resistance, especially during or under any authoritarian regime, or especially before any election. Okay, so I see that the story should be there, despite all these community standard and etc., etc. What is your take or thought on this?
It is fundamentally challenging today to be both hostage to the reach that social media platforms would give your story, which you can't get otherwise, and at the same time be hostage to the phenomenon that you mentioned, which is corporate decisions, sometimes in concert with governments, that when taken mean that important stories aren't seen by as many who would otherwise have seen it. the challenge is that none of us individually have the ability to change the way a Meta would think about algorithmic ways that content is presented to an audience. We can't question, because as you say, the phenomenon is that we can't always see it either. We can't prove something which doesn't exist in terms of the data presented to us. Meta would know, we don't have the evidence, so it becomes a really hard case to go to the company with. And this is certainly the case in the times that we live in with Gaza, with Kashmir, and other contexts where we know that the tech companies have a significant problem around one narrative taking over another narrative. And the one narrative that takes over is the narrative that is connected to, in the respective context, absolute political authority. I would only say to you, in what is actually a much more, what has to be a much longer answer, that while it is useful to remain on the likes of Meta, please bear in mind that these platforms are changing dramatically. And that screenshot I had of Facebook in 2007 is, those at Facebook won't recognize it. I mean, not just talking about visually, they just won't understand how that Facebook works, because it's a different platform altogether. I would recommend to you your own self-hosted, for example, WordPress or Squarespace account, retaining the control of the platforms and the places and the cloud spaces that you produce content on, so that shadow banning or sudden account closure doesn't affect you. At the same time, not to kind of divest yourself from, Twitter and Facebook and Instagram or TikTok or whatever that you use, but to bear in mind that here on out, particularly with the executive order banning TikTok, whatever that WhatsApp will do after July's Delhi High Court decision in India. There are things happening in our region under the DSA here, under the Online Safety Act in Sri Lanka. Both sides of the Atlantic are going through domestic legislation that are going to fundamentally change the way social media platforms operate. So what you call and what we know as shadow banning today is going to be the default around restricted audiences on social media platforms. Gone are the times when it would be the case that you would be guaranteed an audience that would be national in scope. That's gone. That's finished. Khata. Right? So I would say very simply, and for the purposes of a brief answer this evening, shift to a model where you retain control over the spaces and places where you put that content up, and rely on social media as a, what you call, academics call a reach amplifier, so that it helps with people getting awareness. And I'll give you a strangest answer. Go back to email. It's got a resurgence globally of email platforms, email newsletters that are uncensorable in a way, right? You can't block email, right? And so think about ways where you can organically grow. There's a platform called MailChimp that can help with that. But if you think about email and you incorporate it in your storytelling, it can be really powerful. You might not think that you get the engagement that you got with social media, but then did that engagement, how useful was that engagement? Maybe 100 people who actually read your email is better than 1,000 people who just like a post. So think about these things differently as well.
I'll come to you. I'd also like to, again, I'm expanding on these situations because how you intervene is also something to worth thinking about. Sanjana, his group actually introduced Unicode in their language for the internet. Drik in Bangladesh introduced Unicode for Bangla because at that time you couldn't actually use the font on the net because it just hadn't been developed. a young man called Shahriar, who was our webmaster at that time, developed it. But before that, we were connected in a different way. We had an old offline FidoNet email network, which connected many of us from within Asia, connected us to Latin America, to Africa, and many things. We were able to be a community because of a very simple technology which we used. But a very interesting thing happened within that. We introduced a thing called electronic bulletin boards. We didn't have internet, but you could have a shared space where you asked questions and debated things. But what we did was, because we didn't, it was using DOS, so you couldn't actually use the Bangla font. What we started doing was to introduce Bangla using Roman text. So phonetically writing out Bangla. And immediately you began to see that it was very different demography. Many people started talking who were obviously on the sidelines, who were threatened by the language. They weren't comfortable debating, discussing, challenging in English. But once it was Bangla, suddenly they felt comfortable and they all dived in. And a whole range of people who were silent for very long suddenly became very engaging on that space. So those interventions can sometimes be very simple things, but it's worth trying to do it. Several questions. So I'm not sure which one. Yes, please. I'll come to you next.
We can take a few, I think. No?
Yeah.
So yeah.
Sanjay had a suggestion that we take a few questions so we can answer them together. So yours and then yours. Is there another hand raised somewhere? One here. And we've got three names, one after another, and we'll do it collectively.
And if I'm on my phone, I'm not being impolite. I'm just taking notes of the questions that you ask.
All right, hi.
Yes, please.
My name is Sazia, and I work for NGOs, but I've also worked as a fact checker. So I'm curious, you said that Ground Views has some historical documents for Sri Lanka that's not available anywhere else. So I can imagine that you've been through attacks and efforts to put you down. So I'm curious as to how, what has been your strategy to keep it up and running. If you could just share that story. Thank you.
The next one at the back. We can.
Hi, everybody. My name is Tarazi Mohammed Sheikh, and I'm a law student at Brack University. So my question is, you mentioned in your lecture that documentation at any stage is important, which you might not want to use in real time, but that may be evidence at a later stage. However, before just coming to this event, I was scrolling through my social media and I saw a picture that was also used during the Rwandan Genocide Commemoration Day. And that is now being used by one of the social media platforms as an evidence for Gaza. And it comes with the description, how that person was killed and how brutal that was and stuff. So, and that also has a reasonably good amount of engagement with that particular post. So my question is, in this age of digital documentation where disinformation and misinformation can be so, it can be so rapid that we probably wouldn't want to go and fact check due to the lack of time or whatever it is. So my question is, how do you suggest that when it comes to documentation of works at a very grassroots level, how do we combat disinformation and misinformation at a later stage when we're using that documentation? Okay. Thank you.
Last for now. You're done. Okay. I think her question is covered, so you can take those two together.
Wasn't there three, or wasn't there?
There
more?
was three, but I think she thinks her question.
Okay. So the first question, I mean, listen, these are really long answers, and I'm happy to engage offline and after the event as well. But because I have been interested in and know my cybersecurity and network infrastructure part as well, from the get-go, like literally from the get-go, Ground Views was established thinking that it'll be shut down. There was little you could do with the physical. I mean, they could kill me, they could kill anybody. So that there's nothing that you could do really at the end of the day. But the network architecture resilience was factored in from the get-go, and so we everything that we did, and it gets technical, so I won't go into it, was about resilience. If something was taken down, where's the backup? if something was particularly inconvenient that was going up, what did we do in terms of protecting it from a denial of service attack? So we worked with companies that are now household names to protect journalists and sites like this at risk. So now again, like, this doesn't mean anything now, but start off as something called Project Galileo, where this company that gives industry standard DDoS protection now gives it for NGOs and civic media and citizen journalism for free. And we started that. I worked with Google in 2012 to create the technology behind some of their VPNs right now. Again, for countries like Iran or wherever else, where journalists and individuals wanted to get something out and publish something or read something. So we designed our work to keep pace with not just what we knew the surveillance and disruption capabilities of the Sri Lankan state were, but because again, this is me. Yeah? I mean, I keep abreast with what's happening in the rest of the world. And I was able to kind of, as an advanced projection, understand that if the state got its hands on this kind of tech, what it would mean, and then take necessary measures. Now, it wasn't the case that it was super expensive. Everything that I did was also with a view of teachability and replicability in our part of the world. So it couldn't be expensive. It couldn't be always necessarily tied to a credit card. It couldn't be a dollar value. Do you understand? Like, sometimes you couldn't escape it. But all I've tried to do in terms of the resilience of the network architecture is also teachable to a South Asian context. Because it needed to be replicable. Exceptional examples are great, but if they're not replicable, they don't really help the regional or the conversation. And so as much as we could, we also kind of designed some of this stuff. It's operational procedures, so on and so forth. But it had security built in. It had cybersecurity built in from the get-go. Because what is now taken as a given today with regards to state to state or state to non-state or foreign state to civil society kind of threats in terms of cybersecurity, it's now a given. But I knew that this would be the kind of theater of operations for inconvenient storytelling back in the day. Because the part, what academics call the path dependency, what it would evolve into, I kind of had a hunch that the online would be the last bastion or repository of things that you couldn't share or produce or put up anywhere else, and consequently that would be also the cynosure of a lot of the attempts to take that content down. So it's ingrained into the DNA of ground views, and also all of what we did actually. I mean, in terms of also what I told civil society to do. There were other organizations who came to me and say, Sanjana, I have this collection. Where do I put it up? There were women activists who came, say, and with gender-specific concerns about data. So so that was a conversation that we, from very early on, we were acutely aware of what the state would do at a digital level to suppress dissent. And we took measures architecturally in terms of financial investments, but also digital hygiene and cyber hygiene and best practices to ensure that we made life bloody difficult for them if they want to do it. They can, obviously, but you made it as difficult as possible, and you made it almost impossible to erase those stories because they were digitally replicated, right? They were mirrored. And you take down one, it's seamless, yeah? And the fact that you took down one becomes the Streisand effect. So when you factor that kind of stuff in adversarially, it becomes easier to resist. And I would encourage that kind of adversarial research as well, if you want to do that kind of thing now. Hey, that's a really good question in terms of what you asked. My mind goes back to 2000 and, when was it? 2008, 9, during the end of the Sri Lankan war, where on Flickr, I don't know, do many of you use Flickr still? I don't know. But it was the repository of all the photos at the time. And there were photos that suggested, with exactly what you said, narratives and content and context that suggested it was from where the war ended, but it wasn't. I mean, they were horrific, like with Rwanda, they were horrific instances, but they had nothing to do with the end of the war. But of course, it helped a particular narrative. right? It helped push a narrative. And then there were no fact checkers, right? Nobody knew about metadata. Nobody knew about what folks are doing today. And so that, that got that was believed. What you talk today of engagement, back in the day also had engagement, had traction, right? So it is hard. You see, again, it's a longer conversation. All these are conversations. None of them are actually present definitive answers, and that's the kind of nice thing about being in this field as well. One of the things I'll say and suggest to you, at an individual or institutional level, it's really important to record consciously, and carefully. Do what you do, but do it well. Don't bullshit yourself, right? There has to be an internal discipline to what you do because of what you said, right? The problem is, and I'll give you one example, when there was a book written of a horrific shelling on a World Food Programme convoy that was mentioned in a book that was a major incident towards the end of the war in Sri Lanka, and another person put up a photo on social media to buttress that point, I brought up the fact that the metadata on the photo was wrong and it couldn't be held up in a court of law. I was attacked because of it. People said, how could you do that? You're on our side. You're undermining our case. Why did you say that? And I said, listen, if I don't say it, and they go to whatever court with that evidence as that photo as the evidence of, suggesting that what actually happened occurred, I said they're going to be thrown out of court, right? Because the collection, the simple thing of the battery not being charged or replaced in the camera rendered that entire set of photos useless. What a tragedy. What a tragedy. You can never go back, right? So when you, if you want to practice the art of recording for posterity, do it consciously. Yeah? If it's a digital DSLR, charge the bloody CMOS battery so that the metadata, and make sure the date and timestamps are accurate, right? If you're doing it out of social media, do screenshots in a way that can be archived, right? I mean, record the URLs, the original URLs, because all that matters. Just simple things. I mean, it's not hard. That is the only defense you will have against the kind of content that will purport to be something, but is actually not. Because then you have the weight of evidence is on your side. Because you have the metadata and you collected it in a rigorous manner, right? So don't do it haphazardly. If you're serious about this, it's not for everybody, but if you're serious about it, then start doing that in a rigorous manner, because that will be the difference between whether it's helpful or not when the time comes. And this is actually, but this speaks to your practice of archival and archivists, and what you've done.
But also, I would say it doesn't necessarily need to be high-tech. It just needs to be well thought out, and it is often guerrilla warfare. One of the things we had, for instance, is we set up human rights. The first Bangladesh human rights network was called Bangla Rights, and we had published a story at that time which was critical of the military. And the following day, we had by then become an ISP. We were actually providing an internet service, but it was dial-up. So people would ring, connect with the server, and that's how so the government closed down all our telephone lines. Yeah. Now, without telephone lines, a dial-up service doesn't work, except that what they had done is they blocked one-way dials. You could still contact us. We couldn't contact our server. So what we did was we had a microwave link on the roof of our building to another building that had a phone line. And through that, it was a narrow bandwidth, but we kept it going. And for 2.5 years, the Bangladesh government couldn't work out how the hell we were continuing to operate. And eventually they gave up. So that too can happen. Other questions, please.
My name is Sairat. Doing my undergrad in anthropology. Love the presentation. I also arrived a bit late, so it's probably because of that. But if you could, I wanted you to, if you could expand a bit on the pitfall bit, because when you're speaking about, for one, sorry, I have to go through my notes. For one, on the issue of capturing the intangible, capturing what is absent or what is invisible. For one, when I'm trying to relate it to our context and our experiences, something that bothers me deeply is rather than an Orwellian framing where there is total control of what we think, it's more towards the kind of conceptualization by the other theorists of the time, not the theorists, the other storyteller of the time, Huxley, who spoke of such a situation where you're so inundated with information that any information, important or otherwise, is rendered irrelevant. And you could be looking at images out of Gaza, but by then you've been pushed beyond the point of acting on it. Because with 15-second reels, you can see at least 4 of those in a minute, and 4 of those can be of all sorts of different things. So that's one of the things that really bugs me, that the content, the information is archived out there, it's in everybody's face. Of course, considering the issues of documenting and presenting it in the first place. Of course, like we've talked about shadow banning, or speaking of extrajudicial killings, we've had this very bone-chilling audio record of a man speaking to his family on the phone as he's being shot to death. But that's what bothers me, is that how do you, it's more a question as an activist, like of how do you organize resistance in such a time where both public spaces and, of course, the cyberspaces are deeply colonized, privatized, and we don't really have room to organize organically as much. So how do you organize beyond that or around that is, I think, what my question is, if that makes sense.
Well, I'm struggling to make sense of what I think were multiple interesting questions, very much on the on brand as an anthro student. So congratulations on that. I love the way you think. There's a connection everywhere. Hey, listen, I think you've answered most of your questions in that there's very little one can do to escape the disconnect we feel today, including around Gaza, as a consequence not of a paucity, but a daily deluge. Because at some point of time, it just becomes too much for you to engage. And so ironically, in Sri Lanka, though it wasn't true, the end of our war was called a war without witness. And it's traumatic for some of us who studied the end of Sri Lanka's war and live with that content and those memories, because Gaza today reminds us so much of those photos and that context, knowing full well also that one of the parties, Israel, was also present in our country back in the day. And so there's a chilling resonance to what we see today, but at some point also it's too much, yeah? You need to kind of also disconnect in order to carry on. I will answer you in a very analog way. Some of the, to date, some of the most compelling social movements and social networking, not in the Facebook sense, but in the very corporeal sense, in the very human sense, was in the early 80s with the mothers movement. Yeah? And with some of these women who are still alive, legendary figures, absolute characters, right? Wonderful, wonderful women who, and I was talking with Shahidul about this, who were driven by the importance of social networking, not volume, not scale, but grounded quality connections. That, not like the hub and spoke model, but as constellations organically grew, right? I'm not going to go into network science theory, but there's a science behind what you call the weak connections being strong connections that connect you to another network. Meaning that those at the periphery of your friend's network can be very important because they may not know somebody who's not your friend. And so carry on the content that is otherwise only limited to your network. These women were amazing at doing that. And remember, there was no fax, bloody email, or, we didn't even have telephones at the time, right? So it was telex or word of mouth, really. And what was really fascinating is that if you take a look at the history of the activism, they use lithography, Roneo, photocopy, typewritten letters to the president at the time. So they and silk screen. I don't even know whether some of in this room know some of these printing techniques, but they use technology to support that network. Yeah, and it's amazing, right? That core network still exists, and there's never been anything like it. And in the early 80s, right? I mean, this is when we had our anti-Tamil program, right? It was a very, very violent time. And some of them were the first letters written to the executive president about the missing, about sons and daughters who were killed. And the point I want to make is that if you take a look at, and if you study as an anthro student or a student of civic activism, there is something there that is not there in our social media activism today. We seem to be driven by a need to determine the success of our activism through the datafication of engagement, which is a capitalist structure and looking at things that are actually at the end of the day far more meaningful when there's human connection. So that's why I keep saying, it's not the tech. What is the story that you want to communicate? And what is the network around which that story can live? Yeah? So I think that particularly with the new generation, it's actually counterintuitive, not getting to think about tech, but thinking about social networking in the old sense. And I know it sounds rather strange, talk to some of the older activists. There is so much to learn from them. Yeah? They had something that they did right in conditions of significant austerity, no different to what we have today, that we tend to ignore at our peril. And in terms of their corporeal lives, there's very little time left because they are very old. And they're not in good health because of the lives that they've led. But I think there's, it's a very old analog answer to just talk to some older people who kind of lived through and did activism in a very different way. And I think there are significant lessons there that we can, of course, use in different ways, but there was something that was there then that is a compelling answer to this fatigue that we feel because we are so dependent on the anger, angst, anxiety, and content that we get on the palms of our hands, and not with the engagement of those concerns and questions in a more human format, even like this, that Shahidul has provided the space for.
Well, I think unless there's a burning question, I think we'll wrap it up there, but thank you again, Sanjana. That was absolutely fantastic, and hopefully the first of many.
Well,